Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. Michel de Montaigne's essay on Democritus and Heraclitus doesn't actually get to discussing those two philosophers and the attitudes towards life that they embody and reflect until close to the end of the essay. But it begins with some, we could say, broad methodological strokes, some expressions of what Montaigne himself is doing in his own project, and then it goes into several other topics, eventually wending its way to discussing what Democritus and Heraclitus represent, which is laughing and crying. So he begins by talking about our power of judgment, our jugement in French, as being a tool, an outil to be used on all sorts of subject matters. It can be applied anywhere. Now, in any occasion is another way of saying it. And what does he mean? Well, he says, if it concerns a subject I don't understand, I can easily learn something from it. That's why I try my judgment on it. If I find I would be out of my depth, well, then I stick to the bank, right? The realization I can't get further across the river that I'm trying to ford is actually some sort of action or achievement, right? Similarly, when the subject is trivial and vain, I try to see whether I can find anything that isn't trivial and vain, something serious, something weighty in it. Sometimes he says that I employ it on some elevated, well-trodden subject where it can't discover anything new because the path is so well beaten, our judgment can only follow in another's track. So, what would be examples of that? Seneca said this, Plutarch said this, Cicero said this. Maybe there's not that much to say, but he does say, in that case, it's still playing its role by selecting what appears to be the best route out of hundreds of paths. It says, it reaffirms, this is the good route to choose. So that's the way we can use our judgment. And he says, when I'm writing my essays, I take whatever subjects fortune places before me. All of them are equally good. Why? Well, because he doesn't suffer from what we might call a vice of perfectionism. Now, he doesn't use that term, but he says that I never plan to expound them, to produire in French, to produce an essay on them in full, entière, entirely. Why? Well, because I don't see the whole, the entirety, the tout of any particular thing, as he says, neither do those who promise to help us do so. Everything has 100 parts and 100 faces. I take one of them, sometimes just touch it with the tip of my tongue or my fingertip. Sometimes I pinch it to the bone. So there's lots of different aspects to any one particular thing that we're going to study, and we can't always get to the bottom of it. Now, does that mean that we shouldn't say anything about it? No. We can see how far we can go with it. And so here's where we're actually going to get to the topic. Still going at it, bit by bit, we could say, not directly aiming at Democritus and Heraclitus. So he's going to say anything that we do, any movement, tout mouvement, reveals us, shows what we in fact are. And so he says, the same soul of Caesar's, which displayed itself in ordering and arranging this battle, is also displayed in his idle and amorous affrays. Caesar liked to screw around a lot. That was part of his reputation. And both parts, the general who's brilliant, the kind of skeevy guy scheming on the side, they're both the same person. And neither one is more him than the other. He says you judge a horse not just by looking at it on the racetrack, but also seeing it walk. In fact, seeing it in its stable. And so we can say this about all sorts of things. Now, going back to, we never actually do see the whole. Yes, it's always going to be partial. So here he's going to bring up something quite interesting. And there's a little bit of an argument being made here in this essay. So he talks about external things. And external things, we think of them as having the same effects on people in general, but they actually don't. So things that are external to ourselves, how do they affect people in different ways? Well, he's going to say that, the soul, it's got its higher and lower functions. Some of these are going to be affected by different things. So he says, death is terrifying to Cicero. One person looks at death and it's, something to be avoided. Desirable to Cato. Cato killed himself, in fact, so he couldn't be used by Caesar. Indifferent to Socrates. And not only are those, death different, health is different, consciousness is different, conscience in this, which also could be conscience in the sense of like your moral feeling about stuff. Authority, the authority that comes from other people. Knowledge, beauty, and all of their opposites, they affect us people in different ways. He says that as they enter the soul, they receive new garments, colored with qualities of the soul's own choosing. So one thing like death going into one person's soul maybe takes on black garments, in another person's soul white garments, in another person's soul gray garments, right? Different colors. He actually talks about brown or green, light or dark, bitter or sweet, deep or shallow, as it pleases each of the individual souls, who've not agreed together on the truth of their practices, rules, or ideas. Each soul is queen in her own state. Now, you can try to train people, you can give them rules, you're supposed to interpret things this way, that way, but different people have, in fact, different points of view on these sorts of matters, and here's where he's going to come to a really interesting conclusion. So, a lot of times philosophers will point out, we don't have control over the external world. Fortune, assigns us good things, bad things, and it's all pretty random, or there's a causality there, but it's very complicated. So he says, let's no longer seek excuses from the external qualities of anything. The responsibility for how we interpret things lies in ourselves. Our good or bad depends on us alone. So let's make our offertories and our vows to ourselves, not to fortune. Fortune has no power over our behavior. On the contrary, as he's going to say, our souls drag fortune in their train and mold her to their idea. So if we say something like, well, beauty, I couldn't resist the beauty that I encountered, Montaigne would say, no, you made yourself such that you could not resist that. Your soul is the sort to be dragged along by that. But we have the possibility, if we pay attention to ourselves, if we work on ourselves, of making ourselves not impervious to fortune, but, able to take what happens to us and shape it to our own idea, or in French, form. So that's a very interesting idea there. Going back to the theme of what reveals us, he talks about playing chess. Montaigne says that's not a very good game. He says it's a silly, childish game. I hate it and avoid it because there's not enough play in it. and I feel ashamed to give it such attention as would to suffice to achieve something good. And he brings up other things that people plan. Alexander planning his expedition to India, Alexander the Great Conqueror, right? Another person explaining a difficult passage on which depends the salvation of the human race, and he says, watch people playing chess. They take that chess game as seriously as did Alexander or the theologian in expounding their thing. They even are affected by the same sorts of passions: anger, vexation, hatred, impatience, ambition to win, carry the mind away. And Montaigne says, this is a kind of trivial thing. You shouldn't really be getting that worked up over it. And he says, this actually has a lesson for us. What I say in this example can be said of all of the others. Every bit, every parcel of a human being, each occupation, each thing that they do or they're focused on, tells us about him. Accuse is the word there. So it tells us about him, but in a way sort of to judge him, and reveals him as well as any other. So people playing chess, people how they eat, people in how they carry out their business affairs, in their amorous affairs, in how they argue with each other. All of these reveal who a person is to us. Now we finally get to Democritus and Heraclitus. So we should say a little bit about this. Montaigne is familiar with this contrast because other authors who he is particularly interested in have written about it at length. For example, Seneca will talk about both of these as options for us. What happens when we face our life, fortune, setbacks? Should we laugh like Democritus does? Should we cry like Heraclitus does? Seneca says it's actually better for us to do neither. Montaigne is going to come down on the side of Democritus. Why? He says Democritus and Heraclitus were both philosophers. The former, finding our human circumstances vain and ridiculous, never went out without laughing and a mocking look on his face. Heraclitus, feeling pity and compassion for these same circumstances of human beings, wore an expression which was always sad, his eyes full of tears. So we got two different ways of looking at the same world of human beings. Right? It's not just looking at themselves, it's also looking at other people. Montaigne says that I prefer Democritus. Why? Not because it's more agreeable to laugh than to weep. That is probably true, right? We enjoy that more. But because it's more disdainful, right? It looks down upon things and says, that's really not that great, and condemns us people, us human beings, more than does the other. It casts a verdict, but a verdict that's a lighter one, right? Because he says lamentation, plainte, right? Crying and complaining, and compassion, commiseration, feeling misery with the other person, are mingled with some respect, it's translated, estimation, right? Sort of holding something as worthy of taking seriously. They are mingled with some respect for the things we're lamenting. Things that we mock at are held to not have that estimation. They're not valuable at all. So now he's going to talk about two other philosophers. He talks about Diogenes of Sinope, the famous cynic, and he says Diogenes, who frittered about all his own trundling his barrel and making a joke at Alexander, doesn't account us as more than flies or bags of wind. He was a sharper and harsher judge, and for me, a juster one, than a guy who was known for his misanthropy. Look at saying human beings are fundamentally bad. Timon, right? He says, what we hate, we take to heart. So there's a big difference between hate and disdain. One, you're going to get angry or perhaps cry. The other, you're going to laugh. Right? He says, Diogenes thought us worth so little that contact with us could neither trouble him nor corrupt him. He avoided our company, not from our fear of associating with us, but from contempt. He thought us incapable of genuinely doing good or evil, and Socrates actually says something like that as well at a number of places. And so he's going to conclude with something really interesting, which he's taking apparently from Rabelais, a previous author who writes this comic piece Gargantua. Our specific property as human beings. So you could say not quite the essence, rationality is our essence, but what's really proper to us. Propre et péculière condition. This aspect of us human beings is just as much laughable, ridicule in French, as able to laugh, risible, right? So there's you could say, both-sidedness to this. We can laugh at other people, but we're also ourselves kind of ridiculous. We can laugh at ourselves. So we can adopt the perspective of Democritus, and if we do that, we're not going to take things quite so seriously. You might say, well, why did he take so long to get there? Well, if we go back to the external things, maybe we don't need to take them as seriously, and we can laugh at those as well and have a better life than those who take everything so seriously. So that's the contrast he's going to draw between these two ancient philosophers, Democritus, the laughing man, and Heraclitus, the weeping one.